I want you to just sort of imagine something for a second. Picture the quiet scraping of teeth on wood in the dark.
Oh, that's a vivid image.
Right. Just a slow, methodical scrape. A pause, and then another scrape. The water around you is freezing, the mud is thick, and the forest is totally silent except for that rhythmic, relentless gnawing.
Working the night shift.
Exactly. Long before humans were, arguing over property lines or zoning laws, long before we invented concrete or climate resilience strategies, there was this creature already out there actively editing the landscape. So welcome to today's deep dive.
And we really have a massive stack of sources for you today.
We do, yeah. It's sprawling. We're pulling from Pleistocene archaeological research papers, historical ledger books from the 1700s, right up to modern ecological reviews and wildlife management data.
It's a phenomenal collection. I mean, we are looking at a chronological sweep covering hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah, paleontology to contemporary civil engineering. And our mission for today is highly specific, but honestly, it's incredibly profound. We're going to look at how a single semi-aquatic rodent, the beaver, reshaped human civilization.
He really did.
We are going to look at how this animal built empires, defined global fashion, and physically engineered the very ecosystems that you and I rely on. The goal here is to prove to you that the beaver is not just, some cute buck-toothed mascot on a coin.
Right, or just a furry resource.
Exactly. It is a rival world builder.
And that phrase, rival world builder, I mean, that might sound like a bold claim on the surface.
That sounds a bit dramatic, yeah.
It does, but as we pull apart the evidence in these sources, it genuinely becomes impossible to see them in any other light. We are talking about an animal that looks at a landscape and decides to fundamentally alter its physics and hydrology to suit its own needs.
Which is wild.
Very few species on the planet do that.
It's basically us, humans and beavers.
Right.
We're the big two. And I was thinking about this as I was going through the notes. What really makes a creature intelligent?
That's a great question.
Is it like the ability to use a tool?
Yeah.
Complex social language? Or is it the ability to physically reshape the earth so completely that an entire web of other species, including human beings, ends up depending on the infrastructure you built?
That is the perfect framework for this discussion, because if we want to understand the vast, often violent, and really complex history of human-beaver interaction, we can't just start with human history.
Right, we have to look at the animal first.
Exactly. We have to start with the animal's radical built-in toolkit. I mean, the beaver didn't just stumble into its role as an ecosystem engineer. It evolved specifically to construct.
So let's get into that biological blueprint.
Yeah.
Our sources detail two living species of beaver today. You have the North American beaver, Castor canadensis, and the Eurasian beaver, Castor fiber. And as I was looking at the anatomical diagrams in the research, it struck me that we aren't just looking at a random collection of survival traits here.
Not at all. You are looking at a highly specialized evolutionary construction kit. Every part of their body serves a mechanical, architectural purpose.
Okay, so let's start with the most iconic tool in that kit, the teeth.
The famous teeth.
I was staring at these high-resolution photos and the biological data, and their front incisors are this vivid, bright orange color. And I always just assumed, that was staining from chewing on wood all day.
A lot of people think that, yeah.
But the research says something completely different.
The orange color is actually a structural adaptation. So the enamel on the front of a beaver's incisors is fortified with heavy amounts of iron.
Wait, actual iron?
Actual iron. And as that iron oxidizes, it turns orange. But more importantly, it makes the front surface of the tooth incredibly hard, much harder than normal calcium-based enamel.
So they literally have iron-reinforced chisels growing out of their skulls.
They do. And the mechanics of how those teeth stay sharp are fascinating, because the front of the tooth is that hard iron-rich enamel, but the back of the tooth is made of much softer dentin.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right, so as the beaver constantly chews and gnaws on hardwood, the softer dentin on the back wears away significantly faster than the iron edge on the front.
That creates a permanent self-sharpening bevel.
Precisely the way a carpenter's chisel is designed.
That is unbelievable.
And those teeth grow continuously throughout their entire lives. If a beaver were to somehow, stop gnawing on wood, those incisors would just keep growing. They'd eventually curl back and grow right through the animal's own skull.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they are biologically mandated to cut wood.
Which brings up a mechanical problem that honestly completely baffled me until I read the explanation in our sources.
The underwater issue.
Yes, because we know they cut down solid trees on land. But they also spend massive amounts of time dragging branches underwater and anchoring them into the mud.
Yeah.
How do you chew on a log underwater without swallowing a gallon of freezing, muddy water and drowning?
It is a brilliant piece of anatomical engineering. So beavers have this thing called a diastema,
Diastema.
which is a large gap between their front incisors and their back molars. And their lips are designed to close completely behind their front teeth.
Like an airlock system.
That is a great way to visualize it, yeah. The lips fold inward and seal the mouth shut behind the incisors.
That is so cool.
So the teeth remain fully exposed to the water and the wood, gnawing and stripping bark while the mouth and throat are securely sealed off. They can operate as underwater lumberjacks without taking in a single drop of water.
Okay, so we have self-sharpening iron chisels that operate on scuba mode. But if you were spending hours submerged in freezing ice-choked water, you have a massive thermal regulation problem. And this leads us to the fur, which is, historically speaking, the single attribute that got them into the most trouble with our species.
Right. And the fur is an absolute marvel of fluid dynamics and thermal insulation. They possess a dense, double-layered coat. The outer layer consists of long, coarse guard hairs.
Those are the ones you see on the outside, right?
Yeah. These hairs are sleek, and they shed water easily, giving the beaver that slick, wet look when they climb out onto the bank. But beneath those guard hairs is the underfur.
And the underfur is the real magic. The sources describe it as being incredibly dense, something like 10,000 hairs per square centimeter.
It is phenomenally thick. And those microscopic underfur hairs are barbed, meaning they lock together to form an impenetrable barrier.
Wow.
This underfur traps a layer of air right against the beaver's skin. So when a beaver dives into a freezing pond in the middle of January, the cold water never actually touches its skin.
That's amazing.
It is wearing a permanent, biologically integrated dry suit.
Which explains how they survive the winters, but they still have to navigate those waters. And that brings us to the tail and the paws.
Right.
Because when you look at a beaver on land, it looks a bit awkward, like a giant walking meatloaf with a paddle attached to it.
A very accurate description.
But that tail is basically the multi-tool of the animal kingdom.
It is highly specialized. The tail is flat, hairless, and covered in a leathery scale pattern. In the water, it functions primarily as a powerful rudder.
Because they're pretty heavy, aren't they?
They are. Beavers are heavy animals, often weighing between 40 and 60 pounds. To maneuver that much bulk through swirling river currents, they need a serious steering mechanism. But the tail's utility on land is just as important.
The counterweight analogy in the notes really helped me picture this. If you think about the physics of a 50-pound animal rearing up on its hind legs to chew through a heavy tree trunk.
The center of gravity would be completely wrong.
Right. Should be wildly off balance.
But the beaver uses that broad, heavy tail as a kickstand. It presses the tail firmly against the ground, creating a stable tripod with its hind legs. This allows it to put immense leveraged pressure onto the wood with its teeth.
It's all so perfectly designed.
And furthermore, the tail acts as a vital fat storage depot to help them survive the lean winter months.
And we can't forget the acoustic function. The tail slap.
The alarm system.
Yeah.
When a beaver is on the surface of the water and senses a predator, say, it catches the scent of a wolf or a bear on the wind, it will lift that massive flat tail and bring it down hard against the surface of the water.
I've actually heard it in person, and it literally sounds like a gunshot echoing across the valley. It's startling.
It is designed to be. That sharp crack travels huge distances over the water, instantly warning every other beaver in the colony to dive deep and head for the safety of the lodge.
Speaking of their senses, the research points out that their eyesight isn't particularly great.
No, it's not.
They are mostly nocturnal, so they don't rely heavily on sharp vision. But their sense of smell is incredibly refined, and they use it for something the sources call castoreum.
Castoreum is a fascinating substance. Both male and female beavers possess castor sacs, which are glands located near the base of their tail.
Okay.
These sacs secrete castoreum, which is a thick, highly aromatic, oily compound. Beavers use it as a sophisticated chemical communication system.
They build little scent mounds.
They do. They dredge up handfuls of mud and decaying leaves from the bottom of the pond, pile it up on the bank, and secrete castoreum over it.
Like a chemical billboard.
Exactly. It acts as a territorial marker that tells other passing beavers, this watershed is claimed, a healthy family lives here, move along.
We are definitely going to circle back to castoreum because Human beings eventually figure out how to exploit that chemical language in some incredibly dark ways.
Unfortunately, yes.
But looking at the family structure, the life cycle of these animals, it's quite domestic.
Yeah. They are deeply family-oriented animals. They form monogamous breeding pairs and mate in the deep winter, usually January or February. And the gestation period is roughly 105 to 107 days.
And when the kits are born in the spring, the sources mention they are incredibly advanced compared to other rodents. Because, like a mouse or a rat, is usually born naked, blind, and helpless.
Beaver kits are born fully furred, with their eyes open, and they are capable of swimming within 24 hours of birth.
That's just wild, 24 hours.
They need to be robust from day one because of the environment they are born into. But if we pull back and look at the why behind all of this anatomy, the teeth, the dry suit fur, the rudder tail, we arrive at the core evolutionary strategy of the beaver.
The predator problem.
Exactly. The beaver did not evolve to be fast. If a wolf, a mountain lion, or a pack of coyotes catches a beaver out in an open meadow, the beaver is almost entirely defenseless. It is slow and cumbersome.
So instead of evolving speed, it evolved architecture.
It evolved to build a watery fortress. The entire purpose of a beaver dam is to take a shallow, fast-moving stream, a place where a beaver could easily be ambushed by a terrestrial predator, and transform it into a deep, wide, still pond. The beaver is literally building a moat.
Let's break down the mechanics of that because the logistics are just wild. The beaver is an herbivore. It eats the cambium layer, the soft inner bark of trees like poplar, aspen, willow, and birch.
Yes.
But it uses the exact same material it eats to construct its infrastructure.
They fell the trees, eat the nutrient-rich bark, and then use the stripped logs and branches to build the dam. They weave the wood together across the flow of the stream.
Like weaving a basket.
Right. And then they dredge up stones and heavy mud from the bottom, using their highly dexterous front paws, packing it into the wooden framework to make it watertight.
They're the zoning board, the masonry team, and the night shift maintenance crew all in one.
They truly are.
And once they raise the water level, they build their lodge out in the deepest part of the pond.
And the lodge is a masterpiece of defensive engineering. It looks like a random pile of sticks and mud from the surface, but the walls can be several feet thick. In the winter, that mud freezes as solid as concrete. Oh, wow. A bear could stand on top of it and not break through.
But the real genius is the entrance.
The entrances are always located underwater. To get into the dry, central living chamber of the lodge, you have to hold your breath, swim down into the dark, freezing water, and navigate a submerged tunnel that angles upward into the house.
So it's totally safe.
It is a fortress designed so that terrestrial predators simply cannot reach them.
But here is the massive evolutionary trade-off. This incredible biological toolkit kept them safe from wolves and bears for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yes.
But it also made them incredibly visible. I mean, you can hide a rabbit burrow. You cannot hide a 50-acre flooded valley in a massive wooden dam.
You are broadcasting your location to the entire ecosystem. A beaver pond is a giant neon sign that says, "A large, fat, rich, fur-covered animal is living right here." And that brings us to the deep time history of human-beaver interactions. Because our species has been reading those signs for a very, very long time.
And I want to emphasize just how far back this goes. When you hear human-beaver interaction, most people immediately picture like a French fur trader in a canoe in the 1600s.
Sure.
But the archaeological data in our stack of sources pushes the timeline back to an almost incomprehensible degree.
We have to shift our perspective from centuries to millennia here. One of the most striking pieces of evidence comes from an archaeological site called Bilsingsleben in central Germany.
Right.
Researchers there excavated beaver bones that bear distinct, deliberate cut marks from stone tools.
And the dating on those bones.
Roughly 400,000 years old.
400,000 years. That is mind-bending. We aren't even talking about modern Homo sapiens at that point.
No, we are talking about Middle Pleistocene hominins. Early human ancestors were hunting beavers before we even had the biological hardware we possess today.
And from a survival standpoint, it makes perfect logical sense.
It really does. Consider the nutritional landscape of Pleistocene Europe. It was harsh, cold, and demanding. In that environment, animal fat is not a luxury. It is absolute survival fuel.
And a beaver is basically just a swimming calorie packet.
Exactly. A beaver is incredibly rich in dense protein and, crucially, thick layers of fat.
Plus, they are predictable. A herd of deer might migrate hundreds of miles. But if you find a beaver lodge, You know exactly where the animal sleeps, where it eats, and where it swims. It is a stationary food source.
Furthermore, hunting a beaver provided early hominins with resources far beyond just calories. They yielded thick, durable hides and incredibly warm fur. And as we discussed earlier, the beaver's biological toolkit was easily co-opted.
The teeth.
Yes.
The sources note that archaeological sites repeatedly turn up rodent incisors, specifically beaver teeth, that had been used by early humans as scraping or carding tools.
It is a literal transfer of technology. The iron-reinforced tooth was a biological chisel in the beaver skull, and it simply became a handheld chisel in the grip of an early human.
That is so cool to think about.
It was the perfect tool for working wood or scraping hides long before the invention of metallurgy.
So in deep prehistory, the relationship is very pragmatic. It's about survival, calories, and tools. But as human societies evolved, specifically in Europe and Asia, the way we thought about the beaver started to get incredibly weird.
Very weird.
The pragmatic relationship got overwritten by some very bizarre cultural psychology.
The historical records from ancient and medieval Eurasia are full of profound misunderstandings of beaver biology. Over centuries, a widespread myth developed and was recorded as absolute fact in ancient medical texts and medieval bestiaries regarding how beavers escape from hunters.
I was reading the translated text of this myth in our sources, and it is almost too strange to believe.
It is quite something.
The story went that if a beaver was being chased by a hunter and realized it couldn't outrun the dogs, it would turn around, bite off its own testicles, and throw them at the hunter's feet.
Yes.
And the hunter, having gotten what he wanted, would stop the chase, and the beaver would escape with its life.
It sounds absurd to a modern listener, but this belief was pervasive. It appeared in the writings of Aesop, in the works of the Roman natural philosopher Pliny the Elder, and in countless medieval texts.
But the biology is entirely fabricated. First of all, as we mentioned earlier, a beaver's testicles are internal.
Right.
You can't even see them from the outside, let alone bite them off. Second, the prize the hunters were actually after wasn't the testicles at all.
They were after the castor sacs, which produced the castoreum we discussed earlier.
Right.
Ancient and medieval medicine placed immense, almost magical value on castoreum. Because it contains compounds derived from the willow bark, the beavers eat specifically salicylic acid, which is the active ingredient in modern aspirin. Castoreum did actually have some pain-relieving properties.
So it wasn't total snake oil.
No, it had a pharmacological basis. But the medical establishment of the time turned it into a cure-all. They prescribed it for everything from headaches and fevers to hysteria and sleep disorders. The demand for castoreum was astronomical, which drove intense hunting pressure.
But why invent the story about the animal mutilating itself? Why not just say, we hunt them for their glands?
Because medieval bestiaries were rarely concerned with zoological accuracy. They were concerned with moral instruction.
Oh, interesting.
The natural world was viewed as a text written by God to teach humans moral lessons. The myth of the beaver pasting away its prized body parts to save its life was perfectly tailored to serve as a Christian allegory.
The sources explain this clearly. The beaver became a metaphor for the righteous man.
Exactly.
The hunter represented the devil, and the testicles represented worldly sins or earthly wealth. The moral of the story was that a good Christian must aggressively cast away their sins and worldly desires to save their eternal soul.
It was a very neat package for them.
It is such a strange psychological phenomenon. When human beings encounter an animal that we don't fully understand, we have this intense urge to overwrite the biological reality of the creature with our own cultural baggage.
We really do.
We turn a complex living ecosystem engineer into a convenient two-dimensional moral cartoon.
It represents a profound shift in how humans interacted with the natural world. Instead of observing the animal as an integral, functioning part of the wetland ecosystem, medieval European culture abstracted it.
Right.
They turned it into a symbol and simultaneously hunted the physical animal almost to the point of extinction across the European continent.
Which provides a really stark contrast to how indigenous communities in North America were interacting with the beaver during the exact same historical period.
Yes, a massive contrast.
And the sources are careful to point out that we shouldn't generalize. There are hundreds of distinct indigenous cultures across the continent, from the subarctic to the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest, and their practices varied.
Of course.
But broadly speaking, the relationship was fundamentally different.
The indigenous relationship with the beaver was rooted in deep ecological literacy and subsistence logic. The beaver was a vital, respected part of a living, interconnected landscape.
From a practical standpoint, it was a cornerstone of winter survival. In the deep winter, when other game was scarce, Beaver lodges could be located beneath the ice.
Yes.
The meat was a crucial food source, and the fat was incredibly valuable. The tail in particular was rendered down and considered a dense, calorie-rich delicacy.
And the fur, of course, was utilized for incredibly warm clothing. But the usage went beyond simple extraction. The relationship was reciprocal and embedded in cultural narratives. In many indigenous oral traditions, the beaver is depicted not as a resource, but as a teacher.
A teacher, right.
A powerful water spirit, or a transformer of the landscape.
They recognized the beaver's agency. They saw the causality of the ecosystem. They understood that when a beaver dammed a stream, it wasn't just building a house for itself. It was creating a massive wetland that provided habitat for waterfowl, spawning grounds for fish, and lush summer vegetation for moose to graze on.
Indigenous hunters understood that their own survival was intrinsically tied to the health of the watershed, and the beaver was the primary caretaker of that watershed. In a subsistence culture, you use the whole animal out of respect and necessity, and you manage the harvest to ensure the population remains robust.
But that local, intimate, ecologically grounded relationship was about to collide with a global economic force that did not care about the health of the watershed.
Not at all.
It only cared about the fur. And this brings us to the era of soft gold, the transatlantic fur trade of the 16th to the 19th centuries.
This is the period where the beaver transitions from being a biological organism into the mechanical engine of imperial expansion. And to understand the staggering scale of what happened to North America, we have to look across the ocean to European fashion. Specifically, we have to talk about hats.
Beaver felt hats. It seems almost ridiculous to a modern mind that a continent could be mapped, conquered, and fundamentally altered because people in London and Paris wanted a specific type of headwear.
It does seem absurd.
But for centuries, the beaver hat was the ultimate symbol of elite class, wealth, masculinity, and social standing in Europe.
If you were an aristocrat, a successful merchant, or a military officer, you wore a beaver hat. It was not optional. It was a mandate of your social class.
But why beaver? Why didn't they just use sheep's wool or rabbit fur or the hides of animals they had already domesticated?
It comes down to the microscopic architecture of the beaver's underfur that we discussed earlier. Remember those tiny barbs on the thousands of dense hairs?
Oh, right, the ones that lock together.
Exactly. Hat makers, known as hatters, developed a process called felting. They would shave the underfur off the beaver pelt and subject it to a grueling process involving boiling water, heavy pressure, and constant friction.
The sources describe it as almost industrial pounding and rolling.
Yes. Under that heat, moisture, and motion, those microscopic barbs on the beaver fur act like thousands of tiny grappling hooks. They lock tightly into one another, binding the loose fur into an incredibly dense, solid fabric.
And because the beaver evolved that fur to survive freezing, icy water, the resulting felt fabric retained those exact properties. It was naturally waterproof.
It was.
It held its shape perfectly in a torrential London downpour, whereas a cheap wool hat would sag, shrink, and absorb water like a sponge.
The beaver felt hat was functionally indestructible and aesthetically luxurious. It was the highest quality textile available. And the economic data in our sources reflects just how valuable this material was. There's a fantastic ledger example from Connecticut in 1827 that perfectly illustrates the market.
Right, the price comparison. In 1827, a common everyday wool felt hat cost about 50 cents. A high-end men's beaver hat cost between $5 and $8.
That is a staggering price disparity. It represents a 10-fold to 16-fold increase in costs.
A beaver hat was the Rolex watch of the 17th and 18th centuries. It was a wearable bank account. If you walked down the street wearing a wide-brimmed beaver felt hat, you were broadcasting your wealth to everyone who saw you.
You really were.
But there was a massive supply chain problem. By the time this fashion reached its peak, the European beaver, castor fiber, had already been hunted almost to extinction.
European watersheds had been stripped bare. So when early European explorers and colonizers arrived on the shores of North America and realized that the continent's river systems were absolutely teeming with tens of millions of Castor canadensis.
The North American beaver.
Right. It sparked a frenzy of extraction.
The fashion craze literally redrew the map of the world. It drove the creation of massive, transnational corporate monopolies.
Like the Hudson's Bay Company.
Exactly, which was chartered by the English crown all the way back in 1670. They were granted exclusive trading rights over the entire watershed of Hudson Bay. That is a landmass the size of modern-day India, and it was handed to a corporation entirely for the purpose of extracting beaver pelts.
And that wealth fueled intense, violent colonial rivalries. The French pushing down from Canada, the British pushing west from the Atlantic colonies, the Dutch in New York, and eventually the Americans, they were all fighting proxy wars and establishing military forts to control access to prime beaver habitat.
The beaver pelt became so ubiquitous that it ceased to be an animal product and actually became a standardized unit of fiat currency.
The made beaver.
Right.
This was the official accounting unit of the fur trade. A made beaver was defined as one prime adult beaver pelt, harvested in the winter when the fur was at its thickest, and properly stretched and dried.
You could walk into a trading post and exchange one made beaver for a brass kettle, or trade 3 made beavers for a woolen blanket, or trade 10 of them for a musket. They were literally trading skins like standard banknotes.
And this commodification of the beaver had devastating cultural impacts. It pulled self-sustaining indigenous economies into the volatile web of global capitalist markets.
Yeah.
European trading companies relied heavily on indigenous hunters and trappers who possessed the generational ecological knowledge required to locate and harvest beavers in the dead of winter.
They traded manufactured European goods, metal axes, firearms, woven cloth, and tragically, alcohol for the pelts.
But the sheer insatiable scale of the European demand meant that local beaver populations were rapidly decimated. The mechanics of the fur trade required constant geographic expansion.
Because when a river valley was completely trapped out and every single beaver was gone, the hatters in London didn't suddenly say, oh, well, we have enough hats now. The demand remained perfectly constant.
Exactly the opposite. As supply dropped, prices rose, incentivizing even more aggressive trapping. So the colonial frontier was continuously pushed further and further west into unexploited territory.
Just kept moving.
The relentless search for fresh beaver streams opened up river corridors, established deep inland portage routes, and laid down the geographic groundwork for what would become mass colonial emigration.
Like the Oregon Trail. The sources explicitly state that the pathways and mountain passes that pioneers later used in their covered wagons were originally scouted, mapped, and utilized by fur trappers pushing into the Rocky Mountains because the eastern seaboard had completely run out of beavers.
The macro view of this historical era is truly astounding. The beaver was completely stripped of its biological context. To the global market, it was merely an abstraction. It was a line item in a transatlantic ledger book.
Yeah.
And the pursuit of that abstract wealth actively reshaped national borders, displaced countless indigenous populations, and escalated imperial conflicts across the globe.
Next time you pull a waterproof synthetic jacket out of your closet, think about this history. Think about how consumer demand for a functional, waterproof garment physically altered the planet. It is chilling to realize that a desire for luxury headwear funded global empires and drained the wetlands of an entire continent.
It is a profound demonstration of how market forces interact with ecology. But to fuel this massive imperial machine, to get millions upon millions of pelts packed into bales and loaded onto ships bound for European hatters, human beings had to master the incredibly difficult mechanics of the hunt.
And that is a crucial point to explore. Because you cannot just walk into a forest, point a musket into the trees, and shoot a beaver the way you might hunt a deer or a wild turkey.
No, open field hunting tactics are completely useless against beavers. A beaver spends the vast majority of its time either submerged in dark, murky water or safely barricaded inside a lodge with thick mud walls and underwater entrances.
So, to successfully hunt a beaver, you have to learn how to read the architecture of the landscape. The sources refer to this as reading the water. And the level of forensic detail involved is fascinating.
A skilled trapper isn't just looking for physical footprints in the mud. They are looking for subtle disruptions in the ecosystem. They are looking for freshly gnawed stumps with those distinct cone-shaped chew marks. They are scanning the banks for drag marks, indicating where heavy branches were pulled down into the water.
They look for mudslides on the steep riverbanks where beavers continuously slide down into the water. And in the winter, when the pond freezes over, which is when the pelts are at their prime, trappers would look for trails of air bubbles trapped perfectly underneath the clear ice, marking the underwater swimming routes between the lodge and the food cache.
It required deep, interpretive ecological literacy. If a trapper saw fresh, pale wood chips floating in the eddy of a stream, they knew a beaver had been working there within the last few hours. If the dam was patched with fresh, wet mud, the colony was highly active.
Historically, before the mass production of steel, capture methods were highly labor-intensive. Indigenous hunters utilized a variety of techniques, setting complex snares along the mudslides, constructing heavy deadfall traps that would drop logs on the animal, or using nets.
And in the deep winter, they employed under-ice spearing. They would locate the underwater entrances to the lodge, cut holes in the ice, and use specialized barbed spears to strike the beavers as they swam out of the lodge to access their underwater food cache.
But as the commercial fur trade exploded and the demand required industrial-scale extraction, the technology shifted rapidly. The introduction of mass-produced metal foothold traps and later body grip traps changed the entire paradigm of the hunt. And this introduces one of the most sinister psychological ironies we've discussed so far.
The use of castoreum bait.
Exactly. Remember how we discussed the castor sacs and how beavers use castoreum to scent mark their territory and communicate with other beavers?
Human trappers learned to turn that chemical language against the animal. They would harvest the castor sacs from dead beavers and use the oily secretion to create highly potent lures.
It's so dark.
It is. A trapper would set a heavy steel foothold trap in the shallow water near the bank, just inches below the surface.
And then they would take a stick, dip it in the castoreum lure, and stick it in the mud bank directly above the submerged trap.
The beaver swimming by would smell the castoreum. To the beaver, that scent meant arrival. An intruder from another colony had entered its territory.
Right.
Driven by profound territorial instinct, the beaver would swim to the bank, place its hind foot down in the shallow water to rear up and investigate the scent, and immediately trigger the steel jaws of the trap.
Hunting a beaver in this era wasn't really a hunt, it was a heist. You are studying their complex security systems, you are identifying their hidden underwater entrances, and you are literally hacking their chemical communication network just to steal the prize. You are taking their own evolutionary intelligence and using it as the weapon against them.
And the introduction of the steel trap created a vast ethical and psychological distance. As the sources point out, traditional subsistence hunting required an intimate, physical, and often respectful encounter with the animal in its own environment. Industrial trapping mechanized the process. It turned that deep ecological literacy into a silent, automated machine of death. A trapper could study the habits, see 50 traps across a watershed, walk away, and the animals would meet the trap alone, in the dark.
And the kill itself was only the beginning of the labor. The Citral documents refer to the processing of the animal as the second hunt. If you successfully catch a beaver in an icy river in November, you now have to retrieve a soaking wet carcass that might weigh 50 pounds, pulling it out of the freezing water with your bare hands.
And then comes the incredibly precise, grueling work of skinning and processing. The economic value of the pelt depended entirely on its flawless condition. If a trapper slipped with their knife and nicked the prime fur or put a hole through the center of the pelt, the trade value per post would plummet.
The pelt had to be cleanly, meticulously removed from the carcass. Then it had to be fleshed, which meant taking a scraping tool and painstakingly removing every single ounce of fat and muscle tissue from the leather side of the skin so it wouldn't rot.
Once clean, the skin had to be stretched incredibly tight onto a circular wooden hoop or tacked onto a board and allowed to dry slowly by a fire. If it dried too fast, it became brittle and cracked. If it dried too slow, it rotted.
It is exhausting, back-breaking labor. You are doing this work by the light of a campfire, your hands are freezing, you're covered in grease, and the tragedy of the industrial model is what happened to the rest of the animal.
Right, the waste.
Because the transatlantic market only valued the pelt, the processor prioritized the skin above all else. The nutrient-dense meat, the thick fat, the bones in many commercial trapping operations. All of that was simply left behind on the riverbank as waste.
The living, complex animal was conceptually narrowed down to its single most profitable component. When the global market demanded hats, the beaver ceased to be an ecosystem engineer and became nothing more than a skin. That is the purest definition of extractive capitalism.
But when human beings successfully execute that heist millions upon millions of times, and we systematically strip an entire continent of its foundational engineers, well, the landscape itself begins to collapse. And the ecological fallout of the fur trade was catastrophic.
By the year 1900, the situation was biologically dire. the Eurasian beaver, castor fiber, had been reduced to just a few scattered, highly isolated remnant populations in places like Norway and Russia.
Just a handful left.
And the North American populations, which experts estimate once numbered anywhere from 60 to 400 million individuals before European contact, were severely depleted, completely wiped out across massive swaths of the United States.
And ironically, what finally stopped the slaughter wasn't a sudden awakening of human environmental consciousness. We didn't suddenly realize we were destroying the Earth. We just changed our fashion preferences.
Silk hats.
Exactly. Silk hats became cheaper to produce and far more fashionable in European high society than felt hats. And the demand for beaver pelts finally crashed. The market evaporated.
But the physical damage to the continent's hydrology was already done. When you remove the engineer, what happens to the water? It fundamentally changes its behavior. Without thousands of beaver dams acting as speed bumps across the landscape, rivers and streams began to run much faster.
And when water moves fast, it changes the geometry of the Earth. The sources explain the mechanics of incision. A fast-moving stream acts like a saw blade cutting into the dirt. It incises, cutting a deep, steep-walled trench into the valley floor.
And as the stream cuts deeper, it physically disconnects from its surrounding floodplain. The water no longer spills over the banks during spring melts, and because the dams were gone, the massive, sprawling wetlands behind them simply drained away.
It's like pulling the plug out of a massive bathtub. The water rushes away downstream, straight into the ocean, instead of lingering on the land.
The loss of those beaver-created wetlands resulted in a staggering loss of biodiversity. Those slow-moving ponds were complex habitats. Without them, we lost crucial spawning grounds for salmon and trout.
Right.
We lost the shallow, reedy margins that amphibians rely on. Waterfowl lost their nesting sites. Songbirds lost the insect-rich willow thickets. The entire web unraveled.
And human landscapes became incredibly fragile and vulnerable to extremes. Without those spongy, water-holding wetlands soaking up the spring rains, floods became significantly more devastating because millions of gallons of water were rushing downstream all at once. And droughts. Yeah, in the summer, droughts hit much harder because there was no stored water slowly leaching back into the water table to keep the vegetation green.
By firing the continent's primary water managers, human beings simplified the hydrology of North America. We made it fast, straight, and dry. However, the narrative of the beaver does not end in tragedy. Over the course of the 20th century, the story pivots dramatically.
Thanks to a combination of modern conservation laws, highly regulated trapping quotas, and active reintroduction programs, where wildlife agencies literally parachuted beavers into remote wilderness areas.
Which is a whole other crazy story.
It really is. But because of all that, the beaver has made an astonishing comeback.
The population recovery is one of the greatest conservation success stories in modern history. The USDA currently estimates there are between 6 and 12 million beavers active in North America today. And in Europe, a comprehensive 2021 ecological review showed that castor fiber has rapidly expanded back into the vast majority of its former historical range.
Which is incredible news for the ecosystem. But it immediately triggered a massive, highly visible conflict with modern human society. Because the beaver didn't come back to the pristine wilderness of the 1500s.
No, they did not.
It came back to a landscape that humans had rigidly mapped, zoned, and paved over with concrete.
And this ushers in what wildlife managers refer to as the nuisance era.
Because when a beaver returns to a stream today, it has no concept of human property lines. It doesn't care that the county just spent $4 million building a highway across its ancestral floodplain.
Right.
A beaver sees a road culvert, which is essentially a large corrugated metal pipe designed to channel water quickly under a road. And to the beaver's brain, that is a perfectly designed, half-finished dam.
The acoustics of a culvert are the primary trigger. Beavers are highly stimulated by the sound of rushing water. To a beaver, the sound of water flowing quickly through a narrow gap means their dam has a leak, and their deep water fortress is draining.
It's an instinct they can't ignore.
Exactly. A metal culvert amplifies the sound of rushing water. The beaver hears it, thinks, the humans started a dam for me, I just need to plug this massive leak, and it immediately begins shoving mud, sticks, and trash into the pipe.
And within 48 hours, the culvert is plugged, the water backs up, and the $4 million highway is under 3 feet of muddy water. And they don't stop at roads. They drown valuable commercial timber by flooding the roots.
Yes.
They flood agricultural fields, destroying crops. They walk into suburban backyards and chew down expensive ornamental maple trees in a single night.
As a result, modern human bureaucracies reacted by shifting the beaver's legal status. They went from being classified as a valuable economic commodity in the 1800s to being heavily classified as a nuisance species or a property threat in the 20th century.
It's a staggering contradiction when you look at the science. Modern ecological organizations like the World Wildlife Fund publish vast amounts of literature, officially recognizing beavers as the ultimate ecosystem engineers. Our sources highlight brilliant contemporary research showing that beaver wetlands act as crucial fire refugia.
The fire refugia data is incredible. During massive, catastrophic wildfires, the deep, waterlogged soils of a beaver meadow simply do not burn.
They just stay green.
They remain lush, emerald green islands amidst the scorched earth, literally providing safe, wet havens for bears, deer, and countless other wildlife while the forest around them burns to the ground. They are our best natural buffer against the climate-driven extremes of drought and fire.
Yet, our rigid property lines and our static human infrastructure are completely at war with their dynamic, shifting style of water management. We want water to stay exactly where we put it, moving fast in straight concrete pipes and drainage ditches. Beavers want water to spread out, slow down, and soak deeply into the land.
It creates a philosophical impasse.
Let me ask you, if you are listening to this right now, think about the roads you drive on every day. When a beaver plugs a culvert and floods a road, is the beaver really the nuisance? Or is the beaver just exposing the fact that our human infrastructure was incredibly poorly designed, failing to account for the natural dynamic flow of water on this planet?
That question strikes at the heart of our relationship with the natural world. It raises the fundamental issue of coexistence, and it leads us to the underlying difference between the beaver and almost every other animal that human beings have deeply relied upon throughout our history.
Because we farm sheep for their wool, we farm cows for their meat and leather. We take these animals, we put them inside fences, we dictate what they eat, we control their breeding cycles, and we manage their movements. But despite relying heavily on the beaver for centuries, human beings never truly domesticated them.
And we couldn't. The biology and the psychology of the beaver absolutely defy domestication. Because beavers are fiercely territorial, they require massive amounts of aquatic space, and their very nature is uncontrollable alteration of the landscape.
You cannot build a wooden fence around a beaver in a wetland, because the beaver will just build a dam, raise the water level, and swim right over the top of your fence.
Or they will dig a tunnel underneath it.
Yeah, or they will just chew the fence posts down and use them to patch the roof of their lodge.
You cannot farm an animal that farms water. Agricultural domestication depends entirely on human control over predictable soil, static boundaries, and managed water resources. Beavers represent the exact opposite of agricultural control. They invite biological abundance, but they do it through constant, unpredictable disturbance of the landscape.
And because they exert so much undeniable labor on the landscape, because they genuinely work so hard, they became this massive, pervasive cultural symbol. We all know the phrase, busy as a beaver.
Right.
They have been co-opted to represent human ideals of industriousness, tireless hard work, and persistence.
This symbolism is particularly intense in Canada. The beaver is literally the official national animal of Canada. It holds a place of profound honor in their iconography. It was featured on the very first Canadian pictorial postage stamp, issued in 1851, famously known as a three-penny beaver.
Wow.
And you see it today stamped onto the Canadian 5-cent coin.
But let's look at the immense hypocrisy of that reverence. We love to put the beaver on our coins and our postage stamps and our corporate coats of arms to represent noble hard work.
Yeah.
We praise their industry in the abstract. But the second they bring that physical hard work onto our private property, the second they start felling trees in a city park or altering the flow of a suburban creek, we immediately call pest control and demand they be eradicated.
It is a profound psychological contradiction. We deeply admire their labor when it mirrors our own human industry, when it is safely contained as an abstract concept on a piece of metal. But we despise that exact same labor when their physical engineering challenges our total authority over the landscape.
They're a mirror to our own civilization. They build vast infrastructure. They alter the environment to make it safer and more comfortable for themselves, regardless of what it does to the other plants.
Huh.
They cut down forests. We cut down forests. They dam rivers and redirect water. We build Hoover dams and redirect rivers. They are our biological mirror.
And the most hopeful part of the modern research in our sources is that human beings are finally learning to look in that mirror and adapt our behavior. We are realizing that we don't have to resort to lethal trapping every time a nuisance beaver floods a road. Modern civil engineering and wildlife management have developed brilliant, non-lethal solutions.
Let's break down the mechanics of those coexistence tools because they are incredibly clever. First, you have flow devices, sometimes called pond levelers. How do these actually work to stop the flooding without killing the beaver?
A flow device is essentially a stealth plumbing system. Engineers install a long, sturdy plastic pipe straight through the beaver's dam. But the intake end of the pipe, the part pulling water from the pond, is submerged deep underwater and enclosed inside a large wire cage far away from the dam itself.
So the water flows freely through the pipe, dropping the pond level, but the beaver can't figure out why.
Exactly. Because the intake is underwater and caged, the beaver cannot hear the sound of the rushing water, and they cannot feel the current pulling against their fur. If they can't detect the leak, their instinct to patch it is never triggered. The water stays at a manageable level that protects human infrastructure, and the beaver gets to keep its wetland habitat. It's an elegant compromise.
We also use physical barriers, wrapping the trunks of valuable or historic trees in heavy wire mesh so the beaver simply cannot get their iron teeth into the wood. But my absolute favorite modern development is the concept of BDAs, beaver dam analogs.
BDAs are the ultimate admission of human humility in the face of beaver engineering.
Human beings, often with PhDs in hydrology, are literally going into degraded, fast-moving, incised streams, taking heavy wooden posts and driving them deep into the riverbed. Then they weave fresh willow branches between the posts, pack it with mud, and try to mimic the exact structure of a beaver dam. We are literally copying their homework to try and restore our broken streams.
We spent 4 centuries systematically slaughtering millions of them to make luxury hats, fundamentally breaking the hydrology of the continent in the process. And now, human beings are standing waist-deep in the freezing mud, trying our hardest to build fake beaver dams, because we finally admitted that a 50-pound rodent was the best hydrologist the planet has ever produced.
Which brings us to the ultimate question that this entire deep dive has been driving toward. How do we, as an advanced, globally dominant species, choose to live alongside the other builders of this planet? Do we demand total, sterile control over every single drop of water, or can we learn to share the drafting table?
It requires a paradigm shift. It requires moving from a mindset of extraction and control to a mindset of coexistence and dynamic adaptation.
Let's bring this all together. We have covered an unbelievable, sprawling journey today. We started hundreds of thousands of years ago in the Pleistocene, with early hominins utilizing beavers for survival fat, meat, and tool.
Right.
We traveled through the strange psychology of medieval Europe, where an ecosystem engineer was drastically misunderstood and turned into a bizarre moral allegory about sin and sacrifice.
We examined the profound reciprocal relationships held by indigenous communities and then watched in horror as those relationships were violently upended. We saw the beaver become the tragic victim of a global fashion empire, commodified into made beaver currency that funded armies and redrew the borders of North America.
We witnessed the brutal mechanics of the heist, the traps, the gastorium lures that nearly erased them from the earth, and we saw the devastating ecological fallout as our rivers ran dry, our wetlands vanished, and our landscapes became brittle. But then, we watched their remarkable comeback, only to see them relabeled as a property nuisance because they dared to flood our concrete culverts.
And now, today, standing at the edge of an increasingly unpredictable climate, we see them slowly being recognized as our greatest allies. They are our partners in climate resilience, in wildfire mitigation, and in the critical restoration of our watersheds. The trajectory from a myth to a luxury hat to a hated pest and finally to an ecological partner is truly profound.
It is a testament to the incredible resilience of the animal, but it is also a striking reflection of how human values and human humility can shift over time.
The beaver hasn't changed. They are doing the exact same work they did 400,000 years ago. It is us who are finally learning how to see them.
The next time you step outside and look at a landscape, whether it's a rushing river, a quiet suburban creek, or a sprawling reedy marsh, I want you to ask yourself a question. Who actually authored this landscape? We spend so much of our time, our energy, and our wealth trying to dominate nature. We try to fence it in, to pave it over, to force it into straight lines. But the beaver asks us if we're finally ready, if we're finally humble enough, to share the authorship of the world with another species. A species whose blueprints aren't written in concrete and zoning laws, but in water, mud, and deep time. It is something profound for you to mull over the next time you see a ripple in a quiet pond, or hear the slow, methodical sound of teeth scraping wood in the dark. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom-tailored journey into the world of the beaver. We will catch you on the next deep dive.